Sure, the Super Bowl's important, but what you should be thinking about for fantasy football is your dynasty leagues. And today we're talking the most important position in dynasty fantasy football. It's the wide receivers. I'll be taking you through my top 50 wide receivers and helping you manage those dynasty teams for another title push in 2025 on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today we're talking dynasty wide receivers as we continue to go through all of my updated dynasty rankings to help you out with your upcoming dynasty decisions. Of course, I'll also be bringing out my fantasy football rankings for the Super Bowl weekend in the coming days. Plus, I'll also be bringing out my first NFL mock draft. I know a lot of you are hanging out for that after we had another top 12 finish in the mock draft accuracy last season. If you haven't already, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. If you've got any questions, pop them below in the comments, or you can message me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. I always respond to all your comments quickly over there, or you can hit me up on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. All of my rankings are over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. If you want to see the full rankings, we go down way below the top 50, several hundred in the wide receivers, in fact. Plus, of course, you can also check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. But let's talk wide receivers today. And we're starting off with the real studs of fantasy football at the moment. And look, the top two for me are very close, but I'm leaning Jamar Chase. He had a career season last season. Justin Jefferson's also an elite talent, amazingly, both just 25 and 26, which is absolutely incredible when you think about how long they've been around for and how long they've been productive for. But for me, I am leaning Chase. When he's healthy, he is always a fantastic option. And I'd prefer a wide receiver attached to Joe Burrow than a wide receiver attached to JJ McCarthy or whoever the Vikings decide to go with next season. So Chase is the number one for me. But Justin Jefferson's still very close and definitely an elite option. So much talent, locked in with a very solid team. The clear wide receiver 2 last year. Obviously had a wide receiver 1 season a couple of seasons ago in his last full season. He is someone that you can feel very good about moving forward. Just not as good as Chase for me. I think Chase has a little bit more upside, but these two are the clear top 2. And in the vast majority of the leagues, you should be taking him with the first 2 picks. I think the only exception would be in a super flex league where you really have to be taking quarterbacks. But in a 1 QB league, you've got to go Chase and then Jefferson. And then realistically, probably CeeDee Lamb would come third as well. Had another very good season, has been top 6 each of the last 3 years. Doing that without Dak Prescott for most of the season is impressive. The big concern here, of course, new head coach, Brian Schottenheimer. I mean, that's just an awful hire. Absolutely ridiculous. I feel like they're probably tanking at this stage realistically, which seems off-brand, but I can't explain that hire otherwise. And even if they're not planning to tank, I think they probably are. Not a great idea when you've got an elite talent like Lamb around, but I think that's kind of where we're heading. So, look, CD's going to be around for a while longer. He's going to put up high numbers. They don't really have any other receiving options, so it's always going to be about Lamb when he can stay healthy. He's got to be top 3 for me. Because it's PPR, Amon-Ra St. Brown is next for me. Does come with a little bit of risk, but he's been so consistent. Top 3 the last 2 seasons. Just gets so many targets. Yardage is solid, but lots of red zone usage for a small guy as well. Very reliable option. The only risk for me, I think, is that he does kind of rely on the Lions being good. And they have been consistently good the last few seasons, especially in the regular season, but that doesn't mean that it'll necessarily stay that way, especially when they're losing someone like Ben Johnson. So it is possible they may fall back at some stage, and that's going to really hurt St. Brown's production. I feel like his production is a lot more linked to the quality of the team than it is with someone like a Chase or a Jefferson or a Lamb who can produce with pretty much any quarterback, although we did see Chase struggle in 2023. But realistically, these guys get any quarterback, they're going to be solid. The team doesn't need to be good for them to be good. I'm not sure that that's true for St. Brown. I think if the team's struggling, he's going to struggle relative to a lot of these guys. Malik Neighbors is number 5 for me, and we've seen he can definitely produce with bad quarterback play in his rookie season, finishing as the wide receiver 6 and only 7 touchdowns. Imagine if he just had a normal touchdown total for an elite wide receiver. He's going to be even higher than that. Obviously very young, and that really helps as well at only 22. I think there's a valid argument to take him over St. Brown, especially if you're in a rebuild phase. In fact, if you're in a rebuild phase, I think you can even argue to take him over Lamb as well. I feel like he's going to produce long-term. We know how talented he is. We knew that coming into the league, but to actually see him produce in this team is huge. They get a proper quarterback in next season. That's even better. I don't know who they're going to end up with. You'll have to wait till my mock draft comes out, but I'm thinking they probably end up with Travis Hunter, not a quarterback, and therefore they bring in a veteran option. That could actually help Neighbors. Usually when teams bring in veteran quarterbacks, they're able to produce with the top wide receivers a little bit more effectively rather than taking some time to bed in. So I do feel like Neighbors could be solid in the coming season, but long-term, he's going to be a fantastic wide receiver option. Puka Nacua for me is a little bit risky. I'm still not convinced he's guaranteed to be an elite option long-term. Nearly managed to have a 1,000-yard season, finished 10 yards off, but he missed 6 games. So that shows how well he was doing. Was in line to finish in the top 5 or so again this season without that injury. And that was despite having a total of 4 touchdowns. He's really not a big touchdown getter. He's got 10 career touchdowns across those 2 seasons, despite having like 2,500 yards. That's a very low yard to touchdown ratio. If he can up that a little bit, and there's no guarantee he can, that's going to make a big difference. It's going to come down to the play calling and whether they keep using Kyren Williams et al. In the red zone. So Nacua, very solid option, especially in a PPR. But for me, the others just have a little bit more upside and a little bit more security with touchdowns. I do think there's a viable argument to have Brian Thomas above them, especially in a non or half PPR league. I definitely have Thomas ahead, definitely has more touchdown upside. He embedded himself as the top wide receiver last season. He was someone I was a big fan of, but there was always a lot of risk with him. It was hard to see whether he project into the NFL, how his work ethic would go, how his play style would go. I think we've discovered very, very, very well. Finished as the wide receiver 4 last season in PPR. You could easily take him above Nacua, and you'd have no arguments from me. I just think Nacua is a slightly safer option, despite having slightly less upside. Thomas, though, very much top 7 wide receiver for sure. AJ Brown, aging a little bit, now 28. Has consistently had some very good seasons. Missing 4 games last season definitely hurt. But even without that, he did have a little bit of a drop-off. It is hard to know exactly how they're going to use him with Saquon Barkley around in the future. It seemed like last season, as the season went on, he got used less and less. And we've seen in the last few playoff games, he's hardly gotten any targets at all. So there is naturally some risk there. When you've got a guy who is not necessary to the offense and not getting used in big wins, because with the Eagles, you generally get a lot of solid wins. So for that reason, Brown's a little bit lower for me, and he certainly has his upside capped because of his age and because of the talent around him. And especially Jalen Hurts, not exactly like an elite passing quarterback. He's just generally a good quarterback for the team. Drake London jumped up last season. I was very high on him in 2023 and was very disappointed when that didn't happen. This season, finally pulled it off with a top 10 fantasy finish and about time for a very talented wide receiver. If only they could get Kyle Pitts going in the same way. But it was all Drake London, Darnell Mooney, and of course, Bijan Robinson last season. Despite Kirk Cousins being very inconsistent, London still managed to get 100 catches, 1,271 yards, 9 touchdowns. Really good numbers, makes him pretty secure for next season. I think with Michael Penix, he's going to go pretty well. He's still only 24. That gives him a lot of runway to work with. Went over 100 yards in his last 2 games with Penix. So I do feel like there's plenty of upside here. He seems like a good option. And I think especially if you're looking longer term, you could easily argue you should take him ahead of AJ Brown. Same deal goes with Nico Collins. Despite the fact he's a little bit older, he's 26, but had another 1,000-yard season despite playing only 12 games. Looked really good this season. Was helped a little bit by the lack of Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell really not doing as much as you might expect. That did make them lean on him, but CJ Stroud was not used particularly effectively. Ultimately, they've gotten rid of Bobby Slovak, which is going to help their playmaking next season. Probably, you do think that maybe they'll be able to move the ball more. They just lent on Joe Mixon way too much on early downs, became very predictable even when they were chasing the game. Didn't really use Stroud effectively. I've got Stroud higher in my ranking because I think he bounces back next season with better play calling, and I think Nico Collins is going to have another very good season. Now, outside the top 10, Garrett Wilson obviously got hurt quite a bit with Devontae Adams coming in, but still finishes the wide receiver 9. I think we've got to respect that. Over 100 receptions. We don't know what's going to happen with Adams and Aaron Rodgers and everyone else. They're not really in position with the 7th pick to grab an elite quarterback. I think it's too early for Jalen Milroe, but there's no way they're going to be able to get up and get a Shadur Sanders or a Cam Ward. So for that reason, Wilson's kind of caught in that purgatory once again. We've seen him be relatively effective with poor quarterback play, even with a Zach Wilson, but that was leaving him as like a wide receiver 20-something, which is not what you're looking for. I think his talent is higher than that. He just needs to get the proper quarterback play. That does scare me a little bit. Plus, he is already 25, but Adams is 8 years older and he's still producing. So I do think that Adams has to fall off relatively soon, and then Wilson becomes the number 1 guy. Again, there's just naturally so much risk here, and that's why, for me, Wilson is actually quite a bit lower than those other guys near him. So big gap from Collins to Wilson. Jackson Smith-Jigba had that big season, 100 receptions, over 1,000 yards, ended up as the wide receiver 7, despite having just 6 touchdowns, and not a great season from Geno Smith in general. Still very young and talented. Tyler Lockett's going to fade. The question is what happens with DK Metcalf? Surely he's going to be the squeaky wheel. He's on the last year of his contracts coming up this year. Is it possible they just transition it over to JSN? I think that's possible, but we need to really see it happen. So it comes with some risk, but definitely a lot of upside, arguably more upside than a Garrett Wilson, because he could really be the elite guy in this offense. Was the number 1 receiver drafted in that 2023 class, and it's starting to show up a little bit now, just how much talent he has. Speaking of talented wide receivers, Ladd McConkey obviously went to the Chargers early in the 2nd round last season, and in PPR, he's a great option. Finishes the wide receiver 12. I just don't know that you're going to get the same consistency out of him as you are with these other guys. And he certainly doesn't have the upside. He doesn't have the size. He's just a really good slot receiver in that. I don't really want to compare him to Keenan Allen because he's a different type of player. But with the Chargers, you kind of have to. Playing that slot role, he is so effective. I feel like there's not the security as there is with some other players. They change the scheme a little bit, and all of a sudden he's not going to be as useful. Already 24, and he's only played 1 season. So that is a slight thing as well. But look, still very talented player. Of all the rookie wide receivers, I think he was probably the biggest surprise. I did think he'd be okay, but nowhere near this good. T. Higgins is a tough one because he's a free agent. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with that now. Obviously, now played 5 seasons and been pretty effective in them all when he's been healthy. Health has been an issue. He's played 12 games in each of the last 2 seasons. In fact, since his rookie season, he hasn't played a fully healthy season. And I think that really shows up. Gets a lot of touchdowns, and that really helped him this season. But you've got to rely on the talent here and go, if he goes really anywhere else where he's the number 1 wide receiver, I think he could be very good. We saw how good he was with the Bengals before Chase arrived. So for that reason, I still feel pretty good about T. Higgins. Just has a little bit of inherent risk in there. Speaking of risk, Marvin Harrison Jr., gosh, such a talented guy, and yet they just used him so ineffectively. I feel like that's got to be better next season. I'm still very, very young. They need to get better play out of him in general. He should not be the wide receiver 34 when his only competition is guys like Wilson and Greg Dortch. That should not be how this is working. I know they've got Trey McBride in there to suction up a lot of the targets. Not to mention James Conner is always going to be involved, but you've got to get your elite wide receiver involved. You took him in the top 5 for a reason. He's got to be getting targets. Kyler Murray's got to be better at getting the ball to him. And Harrison in general has to be better at making it happen as well. I think he has the talent. It's just the play calling and the quarterback play that's letting him down. I do think he'll be better next season or into the future. DJ Moore, alarmingly 28 years old now, but signed for another 5 years, and he's been consistently very good. Couldn't go over 1,000 yards, which was a bit of a surprise, but the Bears in general were very inconsistent and very poor. He had a lot of very quiet games, especially down the stretch. Only went over 100 yards twice and never got over 116 yards. There was even that game against Detroit where he had 16 targets and couldn't get over 100 yards, which is ridiculous. I don't know. It's hard to feel good about him. He had a really down stretch towards the end of the season, but and in the middle of the season as well, just had those patches where he was very quiet. But I think that was more play calling. I think with the new brass in charge there, I think Ben Johnson's going to get the job done. So I do think that DJ Moore is going to bounce back and be a solid option. Another guy who needs to bounce back is Chris Olave. He's I don't know. There is some character concern there. He's also not playing well when given the opportunity, but he has had pretty poor quarterback play and pretty pretty poor play calling. So both of those things are going to hurt him. We are still talking about an elite wide receiver. We're also talking about a guy that's only 25 years old. That is very, very young. So a year older than Lad McConkey, and he feels like he's been around forever. So for that reason, I do think you're going to get more out of Olave, especially a guy who has 10 career touchdowns in 3 seasons. That's really, really low. That happens when you use Alvin Kamara and Taysom Hill a lot in the red zone and your tight ends. They do need to get Olave generally involved a lot more effectively. Plus, they need to get him healthy because he just generally was unhealthy for a lot of the season. That comes with some inherent risk, especially when some head injuries going on. But I do feel like the talent kind of tells there, and he should be a lot better moving forward. Another rookie, in fact, a pair of rookies coming up, Xavier Worthy with the Chiefs. Look, he was the only Chief to really become an every down starter last season. Still only 22. I don't think he's ever going to be a traditional wide receiver, but he was playing a very good role, has a big touchdown upside with 9 last season. And we did see he was starting to get a normal amount of targets towards the end of last season. So for that reason, I do feel good about him moving forward. I do think he is going to be a guy that you can't necessarily rely on, but he's got a lot of upside. Anyone attached to Patrick Mahomes, especially with Travis Kelce moving out the door, you've got to feel like he has to latch on to his number one guy. I'm not going to say that Xavier Worthy will be like Tyreek Hill. They're not quite the same type of player, but he can be a very effective player and could be the wide receiver 1 in conjunction with Rashee Rice and whoever else they happen to bring in, given pretty much everyone else is a free agent. Rome Odunze had a very disappointing season, but he's a talented wide receiver. Anyone drafted in the top 10 is generally going to be a good option. That was a very poor season for a guy drafted so high, but still 734 yards. It's not embarrassing. The 3 touchdowns is a bit of an issue, but he got over 100 targets. He was being used. It's a question of whether Keenan Allen comes back as to whether he's going to be particularly effective next season. But think about someone like a Jackson Smith-Njigba, who did take a little bit of time to get going in a crowded offense. But now with this coaching change here, I do feel like you're going to have to feel better about the talented big man. I would happily take Odunze for the upside. Zay Flowers, it's really hard for me to feel good about him. Still very young, has only played a couple of seasons, still went over 1,000 yards, but his touchdown upside is low because of Lamar Jackson, because of the running backs. 10 total touchdowns in his first couple of seasons. It's really hard to see him having the upside to be anything more than like a low-end wide receiver too. But he does have the talent to at least be that on a consistent basis. And sometimes for your wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 in fantasy, that's all you need. So I'll happily take him here given his youth. But I do think there's some guys below him I like better if you're thinking in the short term. Mainly these 2 guys, DK Metcalf, maybe potentially the wide receiver 2 now. Didn't get over 1,000 yards, which is shocking. But look, the talent's there. He's got to be better next season. He really fell off towards the end of the season. Started really well, had 300-yard outings in a row from weeks 2 to 4, and another one for 99 yards after week 7. And then got injured and was just never the same again. After the bye week, coming back in week 11, never went over 70 yards and only had a pair of touchdowns in those 8 games. That's not very good. He's better than that. We know he's better than that. He never finished outside the top 20 in the previous 4 seasons, so he should bounce back. He is aging a little bit. He's now 28, and that limits things as well. But in the short term, I do think he's a fine option. Devonta Smith, likewise, aging a little bit, had a down season. Injuries did not help there, but he is still a valuable part of what they do. Actually had his most touchdowns this most recent season with 8, but other than that, in general, has been pretty consistent, pretty solid. I think that it's all going to be attached to what happens with AJ Brown and Saquon Barkley. They're both there. That's always going to limit Smith and make him the third option. If he can free himself from those guys, he definitely has the talent to be better than that. Other than that, always a low-end wide receiver 2 option. In that same mold as like a Jalen Waddle or someone like that, where you just can't rely on them because you don't know they're going to get the targets because there's always a number 1 guy ahead of them. George Pickens was really inconsistent, some weird stuff going on where he was having his routes limited, and they were talking about it being something to do with just trying to keep him fresh and injury-free. I'm like, what are you even doing? He's your number 1 wide receiver. He should be running every single route. Doesn't make any sense at all. He is the top guy, and yet he wasn't used very effectively. Obviously had some injury issues, but 900 yards is not enough for him. Definitely towards the end of the season had some very quiet games, which hurt, including that week 18 game where he didn't even get a touch. He did get a touch. It just went for 0 yards on 6 targets. Just not good. Not enough touchdowns either. 3 on the season. That's awful for a guy who's elite. they'll have a new quarterback come in, and we have no idea who it's going to be. If it's still a Russell Wilson style quarterback, that's not really going to hurt. But they're also got both of their running backs being free agents, so we might see a rebuild finally in Pittsburgh. We don't know what's going to happen there, but we are talking about a talented player who's played 3 seasons, and he's only 24. Again, same age as Lad McConkey, younger than Puka Nacua by a margin. So, look, the talent's there. It's just, I don't know, there's something not quite right, and I don't know what's going on. But especially from a fantasy perspective, I feel like with that talent, he is going to produce into the future. Jordan Addison, obviously stuck behind Justin Jefferson, makes it hard. But when you're stuck behind Justin Jefferson with an average quarterback, that's going to make it even harder. Couldn't even get 100 targets last season, despite only missing 2 games. Did finish as a wide receiver 20 because he's had 2 straight seasons with 10 touchdowns. That's kind of how he plays. Gets those big plays, gets those scores. Still only 23, which is amazing. Going into his 3rd season. Plenty of talent there. It's hard to feel good about the upside. I'd prefer to take guys that can potentially be wide receiver 1s, but I can see that Addison is similar to Devonta Smith, just with more risk and a little bit less upside. There's less chance of him going to his own team, for example. Jamison Williams finally bounced back. The talent was always there. That injury going into his rookie season hurt so much, and he finally looked healthy this season, went over 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns. The problem is he needs the lines to be really good for him to be effective because he's locked behind the 2 running backs, plus Amon-Ra St. Brown, plus Sam Laporta. There's a lot of talent ahead of him. They need to be scoring a lot of points for him to be involved. They did last season, but can that happen into the future? I don't know. But he is so talented that I do feel good about using him long term. Jalen McMillan is a surprise name on here, but I don't know what's going on with Chris Godwin. It's hard to tell exactly what's happening with him. He's a free agent. Mike Evans is 32. Feels like McMillan has to be the future of this franchise, presumably with Baker Mayfield. Had some good games down the stretch. Admittedly, was helped by getting 7 touchdowns between weeks 14 and 18. But we have seen he can have some quiet games. He was getting over 50 yards every week in that stretch, but in the playoffs struggled against Washington, only 2 receptions for 41 yards. Hard to know what's going to happen into the season, but the upside is huge. I think Evans probably comes back for at least 1 more season, but they might see McMillan and go, well, we don't need Godwin now. And that'll really help Jalen McMillan. So the upside's there. I feel good about him for a guy who is still very, very young at only 24. You can feel good about him moving forward. Jerry Jeudy, he really exploded at times during the season, but Cedric Tillman was out. Elijah Moore's not much chop. He did finish as the wide receiver 11, despite having only 4 touchdowns. But Jameis Winston is just going to do that to you. He just gives a boost to everyone around him because he just flings the ball around everywhere. Had some massive games, including that 235-yard outing against a pretty solid Denver defense. Also had some good games against New Orleans when he put up 142, and against KC as well, where he put up 108. So all these big games in the latter half of the season. Only 1 game under 63 yards in his last 9 games, which is 10 games, in fact, which is absolutely incredible. But I don't think that's going to happen consistently. That was down to some aggressive quarterback play and a lack of other options, and the fact they were often trailing because they struggled. I do think that's going to change moving forward. He is still a solid option, but we're talking about a guy who's 26 now. He's not young. He has a lot of risks attached to him, so you can take him for his upside, but it's entirely possible he becomes someone that's barely usable in fantasy. Rashee Rice obviously has some injury issues coming off that big knee injury, and then, of course, possible suspension issues as well. So hard to know what to make of his situation. He was very good in 2023, but he was the only guy. They had no one else around. It's hard to know what would have happened if he had Xavier Worthy, as Xavier Worthy is now, along with Marquise Brown and DeAndre Hopkins. I think it's probably going to be a lot of Worthy and Rice with a little bit of Kelsey, who is certainly getting used less in the regular season. So you can feel okay about Rice. We've seen him produce before, but I don't feel great about him, which is why I've got him relatively low. Still only 25, but there's a lot to be concerned about, especially because the first season back from an ACL is often a dodgy one at best. Cortland Sutton had a great season, but he's 30 now, which seems crazy. But because he had such a slow start to his career and also missed all of 2020, that did really hurt him. He hasn't been over 1,000 yards since 2019, and he finally did it this season, which is great for him. Finally also scoring some touchdowns, 19 touchdowns in his last 2 seasons. In his first 5 seasons, he just had 14. So that's a big change as well. Bo Nix definitely loves using him, and he's going to be around for a while. So you have to feel good about that connection. Problem is, last year of his contract, does he re-sign? we don't know what's going to happen there. So for that reason, I feel okay about Sutton, but I put those other upside options above him because he is getting older. Jaden Reed, I really don't feel good about this situation at all, but you can't argue with the fact he's been the wide receiver 28 the last 2 seasons, tends to stay healthy, 17 touchdowns in 2 seasons is incredible. They do need to pass the ball more, and I think that's going to happen moving forward. They can't just drive it forward with their running backs the whole time with Josh Jacobs. So I do think Reed will remain the top guy, still only 25, but with lots of talent around him. Not impossible they bring in a true number one, especially with Christian Watson injured and Romeo Doubs inconsistent. I think the Dontavian Wicks thing has to end as well. That's not really working either. So, look, I feel okay about Reed, but there's so much risk here that you do have to take that into account. Speaking of age, Terry McLaurin, career season at age 30. Essentially, pretty incredible. 5th straight 1,000-yard season. Not even the most yards he had, but he had 13 touchdowns, which is ridiculous. Jaden Daniels, by far the best quarterback he's had. Big fan of Jaden Daniels, well, since college, really. Great to see him working with Scary Terry and him finally producing. Really good season. That age is always going to be the biggest issue there, but he's going to give you a couple of good seasons. Just hard to know if he's going to start getting covered moving forward. His play does tend to be a little bit inconsistent, gets a lot of touchdowns, which cover up some cracks, but also had some very quiet games. Had 5 games where he had under 22 yards. Which is not ideal, especially that game against Atlanta where he went like 1 for 7 for 5 yards. That sort of thing happens too often with McLaurin, and that makes him hard to use in fantasy. Brandon Ayuk, what the heck was last season for all the 49ers receivers? That was really weird. Problem is they are all signed for next season. Ayuk is the one with the longest contract. Jennings and Samuel have 1 more year, and they could easily get rid of Samuel this year, I think. Whereas Ayuk, realistically, they don't really have an out until 2027. So they kind of have to keep using him. The problem is 7 games this season. He went over 50 yards once when he just randomly broke out against Arizona. Other than that, he's been very disappointing. Hard to know if he'll bounce back. He did have a couple of top 20 finishes before that, but I don't know. We're not talking about an elite wide receiver. We're talking about a guy who's more like a product of the system. Now he's 27 as well, and we don't know what's going to happen moving forward. Really hard for me to take him too early in Dynasty because there's so much risk, and he could easily just totally fall off. That sort of thing does happen with this style of player, especially when they suffered a torn ACL and MCL, which could easily massively affect their next season as well. Michael Pittman really struggled with Anthony Richardson, and given Richardson's probably back, that's not an ideal situation. Did start to look better towards the end of the season. Last 2 weeks had 20 targets, 181 yards, and a touchdown. Can that keep happening? I mean, potentially, but Richardson does need to get better and use Pittman more consistently. Pittman should definitely be the number 1 over Josh Downs, despite the fact that Downs has been more involved of late. Pittman's also 28, which is kind of crazy. That really hurts as well, but he does have the potential to be the number 1 player in a team that does need to be better on offense. Jalen Waddle, love the talent, but realistically in Miami, he's always going to be behind Tyreek Hill and the running game, and they're not moving the ball effectively enough. Gets too many injuries as well, plus couldn't get over 1,000 yards last season and only 6 touchdowns in the last 2 seasons combined. There's a lot of concerns there. Waddle's now 27. He's going to be with the team for a while, but Tyreek's not going anywhere, at least for next season. So it's hard to feel great about Waddle. He's one of those wide receiver 2s you just can't really trust, despite how much talent he has. It's kind of frustrating. I would have loved to have seen him elsewhere, but he signed a new contract, and now he's going to be at Miami for a while. So I think we just have to accept that this is who he is. On the other hand, Tyreek Hill, look, this is a win now situation. If you want to win now, Tyreek goes higher up the rankings. When Tua Tagovailoa is involved, he is an elite quarterback. Problem is when Tua is not there, very, very, very iffy. Still inconsistent even with Tua. I think they just generally need to be better next season, but we know how good he could be. Back-to-back 1,700-yard seasons going into this year and couldn't even get over 1,000 this year. Still always has a high touchdown total. We're talking about a guy who's 31. That is scary. I think this season could even potentially be his last season, if not his second last. So that is risky regarding Hill as well. That's why I've got him quite low, but the upside is huge. Upside of Mike Evans, also huge. We've seen how consistent he can be. But we're talking about a guy who is not young. He's 32 now. I say not young. For me, that feels very young, but for most in the NFL, that is definitely getting to the end of his tenure. His worst fantasy season since 2017, but once again, got over 1,000 yards, got double-digit touchdowns as he gets most years, despite missing 3 games. So you've got to feel really good about his production. On a per-game basis, it's actually one of his best seasons. It's just that injury really hurt. I do feel like he's going to be good again next season with Baker Mayfield. Chris Godwin coming back would probably hurt him slightly. McMillan breaking out maybe even helps a little bit, but once again has gotten by on just a couple of big games and then just being really consistent. His last 8 games, including the playoffs, he went at least 68 yards in every single game after starting the season pretty slow and getting a lot of touchdowns. So that is incredible. Also 6 touchdowns in those 8 games as well. So he's still producing, but that is going to fall off very quickly. So you can't value him too highly unless you want to win right now. Josh Downs, on the other hand, I mean, he's been okay the last couple of seasons, but I find it hard to believe he truly is the wide receiver 1. He's only 24, solid in PPR, but I don't know. I can't trust him. I don't feel like you can either. He's really a depth option. He's never going to be a top guy. So if you're looking for someone just to give you added depth, if you're starting 3 or 4 wide receivers and you just need an extra man, he's someone who's going to be solid, but he's unlikely to be a league winner for you. Chris Godwin, on the other hand, can be a very effective at the moment. Excellent slot receiver. When he's actually starting, he's just not been getting enough games at the moment. He's been injured too much. It's been an issue throughout his career at times. That ankle injury obviously knocked him out for half the season. After his previous healthy season was pretty disappointing. Needs to be used more in the red zone. He is a free agent now. If he goes into the right situation, he could be fantastic. If he doesn't, he's going to be totally unusable for you. We are talking about a guy who was the wide receiver 2 in 2019, though. So the upside is clearly there. Darnell Mooney had a great season as the number 2 in Atlanta. Will he be able to continue that? Well, that's the big question. He's now 28. Had a great season back in 2021, then fell off. Then came back and had his second wide receiver 27 season. Has never had more than 5 touchdowns in the season. Which has always hurt, has struggled to stay healthy as well. 2021 was his only fully healthy season. So was his last fully healthy season, I should say. So I don't know. I don't trust him, but I do feel like there's at least something there to get excited about. Speaking of getting excited, I was super excited about Keon Coleman last season, and he dogged your boy. He was very, very, very disappointing. Or more specifically, the Bills just used him stupidly. When you take someone in the first round, or at least late in early in the second, you should be using them effectively, especially if they are a wide receiver. You don't go out and then grab Amari Cooper and not use him as well. You don't need shoeless Mac Hollins out there all the time. I understand he's trying to block, but realistically, this was not good player management. It ended up being Khalil Shakir was the only guy you could trust. Coleman, I mean, he needs to be used better. He was just so disappointing. Had 1 reception in 5 of his last 7 games, not including the KC game. So I don't know. I don't feel good about it. I don't feel good about it moving forward, but the upside's there. The talent's there. It is possible he is very good and could be the number 1 guy in a very good offense. We just need to see it happen. And we have seen this happen with wide receivers before. So don't give up on him entirely. I am dropping him down a long way, though. Xavier Leggett was someone I was huge on coming into the draft. Really excited to see him go late in the first round. And then I saw it was Carolina. Obviously, we know that this is a team that struggles to produce with the wide receivers. DJ Moore's really the only guy they've really been good with recently. Adam Thielen, Middle East, had some good times, but Leggett's not that sort of player. He's that big-bodied guy who needs some big plays. Can they make him good? I mean, potentially. He should, I guess, on paper be their number 1 guy. The problem is he's never gone over 66 receiving yards. Does tend to get a lot of targets and can't do much with them. Hasn't had a touchdown since week 9. I don't know. I can't feel great about this despite loving the player. Thielen will be back, but other than that, it's like Jalen Coulter. So it is possible they also bring someone in the draft, and that would hurt Leggett as well. I think their priority should be to improve the defense, and that'll come across in my first mock draft. But it is possible you see a wide receiver come in and then Leggett's value plummets. Jacoby Myers has always been one of those guys that is underrated. Obviously, a former undrafted free agent. Had a big season last season. Wide receiver 29, despite getting 4 touchdowns, is incredible. More fantasy points than the season before when he had 11 touchdowns. That's how much he stepped up. Finally went over 1,000 yards. You got to feel like potentially the Raiders are going to get another wide receiver. They've got the 6th pick in the draft. I think if Tataroa McMillan comes in and is available at that point in time, they probably go him, or even a Travis Hunter. But I think McMillan's the main threat to Myers there. I don't think there's any other wide receivers you take in the first round. If they get a second round guy, it could be that Myers remains the top guy, at least for a little bit longer. But that does add a lot of risk, especially for a 29-year-old guy. That's why he's so much lower for me. Speaking about aging players, and aren't they all? Deebo Samuel, 29 now as well. Last season of his contract could, of course, just be released anyway. Wide receiver 41, despite missing 2 games. Appalling. Really poorly used, really ineffective, just generally disappointing. He's had one 1,000-yard season in his career. He finished the wide receiver 3 because he went like 1,400 yards and 15 touchdowns. Bounced back in 2023 with 12 touchdowns, but wasn't really effective yardage-wise. I think whenever you got Christian McCaffrey and all those other talented wide receivers and George Kittle and a quarterback who's not actually that good in Brock Purdy, it's hard to feel good about Deebo. He really needs to go somewhere else and be a little bit more effective, but I think we're running out of time for that. Davante Adams, absolutely love the talent, but he's 33. We don't know how much longer he can do this for. He's gone over 1,000 yards in the vast majority of his seasons. 2016 and 2019 had 997 yards exactly. But every other season since 2016, he's been over 1,000 except for 2017. So we're talking about a guy who does it consistently. Can he do it again? Depends if he's still at the Jets. Depends who the quarterback is for the Jets. Depends on whether he wants to even keep playing. Where will he go next? Does he go to the Saints to play with Derek Carr? Does he go somewhere else? Is he even able to get out of his contract? We know that he's tried to in the past. Is he going to sit out? So many question marks about Davante Adams. So even if you're in a win now situation, it's hard to trust him. There's surely better options out there. But at least you can get him cheap. Rashid Shaheed, big surprise for a guy that wasn't drafted early to come out and suddenly look really good this season, only to go and do his knee and be out for the season. I don't know. Knee injuries don't make me feel great, especially with a speed receiver. And a lot of his receptions were pretty fluky. It was all deep stuff against some defenses that aren't exactly great. We saw when they took on good teams like Philly and Tampa Bay, he had a total of 12 targets for 1 reception. I think that's what you're going to see a lot of moving forward. Did have a return touchdown in that Tampa Bay game, admittedly, which made a difference. But other than that, I mean, against good teams, he is generally going to struggle. He's also 27 already, which is kind of insane because he's only played 3 seasons and hardly been involved. So hard to feel great about him, but the upside is at least there. Cedric Tillman, another guy who has taken a while to get going. He is 25 now, and he's got like less than 600 career yards and only 3 touchdowns. But it did look good when they finally started using him. Concussions really hurt his season towards the end, but he had a couple of really good weeks going into the bye week. 3 straight top 12 wide receiver finishes. So the upside's there. We don't know who their quarterback's going to be. If it's someone like a Cam Ward, I don't know that he's going to be able to sustain Tillman and Judy and everything else they got going on there with Njoku. I think it is entirely possible if it's Shedeur Sanders, which it could be, that Tillman would benefit more from that. We just don't know what's happening there. That is where the risk is, but he's going to be around for a little while longer. It is going to be him and Judy as the main guys, and I do like the upside for that reason. I think there's an argument to take him over most of those guys outside the top 40. You can take him as high as wide receiver 37 potentially if you're really looking for an upside guy who could be a big star for a long time. It's just the chance of that happening is very low. Khalil Shakir, on the other hand, he's more of a safe guy, doesn't really play in 11 personnel, does tend to be that smaller option that just gets a lot of touches, 7 career touchdowns, did have 100 targets last season, and with the Bills, that is valuable, but the upside is limited. It's also the last year of his contract. He is 25. I don't know. I don't love it. He just feels like a safe option. I don't generally go for safe options in Dynasty, but there is some argument in certain situations that it is nice just to have a safe wide receiver to bring off your bench on a bye week or something like that. Quinn Johnson, other side of the coin, lots of risk. I love the talent coming in that class. He was my favorite from a fantasy perspective. Finally started to show up late in the season, 8 touchdowns on the season, had that big 186-yard breakout in week 18, plus had a big game in week 9 against Cleveland as well. Lots of touchdowns, had a string of like 5 touchdowns in 7 games. I don't really know what we're doing here with him, though. I don't know what his role is in this offense. He does seem to be kind of the wide receiver 2 next to McConkey. We have seen that big body guy in this sort of situation not be particularly effective, but if they let Justin Herbert throw a little bit more, all of a sudden he could be useful. So the upside's there. I just feel like the chance of that happening is very low. Rashad Bateman, another guy with a little bit of upside. Anytime you're in a Ravens offense, there's going to be upside, but it's hard to really trust him with what's going on. He's got a lot of touchdowns last season, but had a lot of very poor games as well. Finished as the wide receiver 40, but I feel like that's kind of his ceiling. 9 touchdowns for only 756 yards is pretty crazy. He is only 26. It's easy to forget that he was actually highly drafted and a very talented player. Will they continue to use him effectively? What's going to happen when his contract ends? I don't know. But I do think it is possible that he will have another solid season. I just think the upside is limited. On the other hand, Marvin Mims, I mean, very, very, very low floor. Was hardly used at times last season, but just started to see his snap counts rise later in the season. Week 17 and 18 randomly had 2 touchdowns in each game. Was getting a lot more targets. Was getting used generally a lot more. But when you've got guys like Troy Franklin and Valet that are going to be around for a while, Cortland Sutton's clearly the number one. Can you really trust Mims? I feel like he's never going to get over like 50 or 60% snaps because of his role, but it is possible he does. He is a former day 2 guy. I do see a situation where he suddenly becomes an elite receiver for them. I just think the chance of it happening is very, very, very low. Now, guys, I didn't include that I just wanted to highlight and mention some win now guys that you can definitely get. Someone like a Stephon Diggs or a Keenan Allen. They're obviously aging. That is the reason that I don't have them in there. But I don't know, there's plenty of upside there. There are reasons to use them, reasons to feel good about using them. Both free agents, so we don't know where they're going to go. Christian Kirk was used weirdly last season, so he's low for me for that reason. Calvin Ridley, 31 now, and with a rookie quarterback, it's hard to feel great about what's going to happen next season. Ricky Pearsall, for example, one of those young guys for San Fran in that rotation with Juwan Jennings. I don't know how to trust either of those guys. So for that reason, I've ranked them relatively low. It's hard to feel good about their role in this offense. Tank Dell, for example, coming off that injury, that's why he's so low. Same thing with Christian Watson. Nobody else I feel particularly good about. Guys like Amari Cooper and Cooper Kupp, I think we're done with them now. So I think we can move on from them as well. And that's really all we've got for my Dynasty wide receiver rankings. If you've got any questions, like I said, pop them below in the comments. Or, of course, you can hit us up on Instagram or Twitter. Would be great if you could like and subscribe. That really helps us out as well. I'll be back with my tight end rankings, of course. We'll also be talking Super Bowl rankings if you're doing DFS or playoff fantasy. Plus, of course, I'll have my NFL mock draft coming out pretty soon, where I'll go through every team's pick of the first round and try to get an accurate outcome again this season. Look forward to seeing you guys on the next video. Until then, enjoy the remainder that we've got of the NFL season. It's nearly coming to the end. I'm looking forward to the Super Bowl. I hope you are too.